Belfast, I am experiencing hard waves on all sides, trying to stay steady as I go, but I keep on heading off course. No damage so far to the hull. We are experiencing high waves though, steady as we can. We'll keep up with you. Belfast, this is Juno. Watertown has disappeared again. Watertown, this is Juno. Do you copy? What are your coordinates? I'm very concerned about the welfare of Watertown. They're right behind us, experiencing some difficulty. No lights or radar is noticed from her direction at the moment. I sure hope he didn't take a nosedive.
The Juno class of light cruisers were a modified design of the Atlantic-class cruiser design. 4 ships were ordered to be built by the U.S. Navy: USS Juno, USS Spokane, USS Fresno, and the USS Watertown. The Watertown was laid down at the Federal Shipbuilding and Drydock Company in Kearny, New Jersey on December 5, 1945. Her construction was being constantly canceled and brought back due to defense policies issued by President Harry Truman and Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, as they wanted to shrink the US Navy from 6,000 ships to nearly 600. But that entire story is worthy of its own video. At any rate, eventually in early 1949, the Watertown got the green light to finish construction. The Watertown was named after the city of Watertown, Massachusetts, since cruisers were named after cities of the United States. She was built with a length of 541 feet long, a beam of 52 feet, and a draft of 20 feet 6 inches. She carried 2 lifeboats and had an average speed of 32.7 knots or 37.6 miles per hour. Her complement was 47 officers and 695 enlisted men. She was launched on September 22, 1949, 4 total years after she was originally laid down. Around that same time, her sister ships, the Fresno and Spokane, were decommissioned, leaving the Juno and the Watertown to be the last of the class. In March of 1949, the Watertown was commissioned into the Navy. Then later, during her first year in commissioned service, she had her shakedowns take place along the Atlantic coast and in the Caribbean. During the sea trial, she conducted battle practice and weapons firing. Then later, on November 29, 1949, she would depart Norfolk following her sister USS Juno to the Pacific. The two arrived at Bremerton, Washington on January 15, 1950, and they took part in operations along the Pacific coast. Eventually, the Juno became the flagship for Cruiser Division 5, where she, along with the Watertown and other ships, were to report for duty in Yokosuka, Japan on June 1st to begin surveillance patrols in the Tsushima Straits.
Korea is a small country, thousands of miles away. But what is happening there is important to every American. We are united in detesting communist slavery. We know that the cost of freedom is high, but we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost.
On June 25, 1950, the North Korean Communist Army crossed the 38th parallel and invaded non-communist South Korea, ultimately starting the Korean War. When this occurred, the Watertown was instructed to patrol the 38th parallel and prevent enemy landings. On June 29, she was among the many to conduct the first shore bombardments of Bokukoko. The USS Juno acted as a mothership or companion-like vessel to the Watertown during the war, since the two were the only ones left of the class, and the Juno was the more experienced of the two, as she has already been active in the Navy since 1946, when this is still the Watertown's first year. During the early stages of the war, the Watertown rarely saw conflict too, which actually upset a lot of the crew, as noted by sailors from the Juno of Watertown's crew seemed ready for combat and they looked like they would give it their all. Everyone but the captain of the Watertown was ready to fight. This was the 3rd ship that Captain Theodore McCoy was in command of. I'll explain a little more on McCoy later on, but I'll leave you with this for now. Before taking command of Watertown, he commanded the destroyer USS Patzner and the cruiser USS Fairbanks. He knew his vessels and understood them, but just as every sailor is, he was very superstitious. He ordered inspections on the Watertown nearly every day to make sure that it was in proper conditions. He had some feeling about this whole ordeal, and it just didn't settle well.
The 1950 Pacific typhoon season saw up to 18 total storms from April 12, 1950 to January 1, 1951.
These storms can be very dramatic for if any ship had to come in contact with them. For instance, on December 18, 1944, Typhoon Cobra struck Task Force 38. Many of the ships were caught near the center of the storm. 3 destroyers, USS Hull, USS Spence, and USS Monaghan, capsized and went down with practically all hands, while the cruiser, 5 aircraft carriers, and 3 destroyers suffered serious damage. But one of the most famous US Navy ship disappearances may have occurred from one of these tropical storms. The loss of the USS Cyclops and her 306 crew, gone without a single trace sometime after March 4, 1918, remains the single largest loss of life in the history of the United States Navy, not directly involving combat. The US Navy and History Heritage Command has stated that she probably sank in an unexpected storm, but the cause of the ship's loss is not known, even after 104 years. On July 19th, the Watertown got caught in more action. Her and Juneau's force, which consisted of Royal Navy vessels, laid down a deadly barrage of enemy troop concentrations near Yeongdeok, which slowed down the North Korean advance southward. Watertown successfully got 2 troop concentrations during this attack. The Watertown got word that the force was to report for duty with the 7th Fleet at Bunker Bay, Okinawa on August 2nd. There, the ships would join the Formosa Patrol Force through the Formosa Straits. The ships were sent there because originally, in late 1949 and early 1950, American officials were prepared to let the People's Republic of China's forces cross the strait and defeat Chiang Kai-shek. But after the outbreak of the Korean War, the United States sent its 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait to prevent the Korean conflict from spreading south. And so, on July 28, 1950, the Watertown departed Sasebo Harbor in Nagasaki, Japan. Shortly after their departure, winds from Tropical Storm Helena began to slowly pick up. The group began to pick up speed from 20 to 29 knots and to counter the 60 miles per hour winds. They all remained facing towards the storm so they could cut through the high waves. Getting hit by a massive wave on either side could be deadly. If that were to happen, it would cause them to roll and possibly sink. On the night of July 29th, the ships were determined to cross the storm into the 7th Fleet. The force consisted of the HMS Belfast in the front, USS Juneau in the middle, and USS Watertown at the rear. Every captain was keeping an eye on each other, and constant messages were being said and documented.
Keep a sharp eye on surface radar, bearing 40, rough waves coming close. Aye aye, roger that. I advise all ships to take a sharp turn west 10 degrees for plow. Aye aye, sir. Aye aye. Steering hard to port, clearing the way for you, Watertown. Thank you, Juneau. Watertown, Juneau, do you copy? Large rogue wave heading west-southwest, bearing 265, range 400 yards. Copy that, Belfast. Roger that, turning right southwest, 250 degrees, over.
The Watertown, Juneau, and Belfast all received notices like this, constantly moving with the tides, trying to stay as close together as they could. Around 8:30 p.m., the Watertown then began to have serious troubles with the waves.
Juneau, Belfast, I am experiencing hard waves on all sides, trying to stay steady as I go, but I keep on heading off course. I might have to slow down to assist if there's any damage. Aye aye, Watertown. I'll be right ahead of you. Keep bearings constant. I'll try to slow down to 25 knots for you, Watertown. Over. Roger that, Belfast. Thank you.
Everything then went quiet from Watertown's end for about 15 minutes.
Watertown, I am not seeing you on my radar. Do you copy? Watertown, do you copy? Over. Right full rudder turning south-southwest 190 degrees. Over. Copy that. Also, have you seen any radar of Watertown? Over. That is a negative, Juno. Over. Roger that.
5 minutes after those messages were sent, Juno picked up something on their radar behind them.
Something's coming fast on our radar, 700 yards north-northeast, bearing 15 degrees. Copy that. Juno, Belfast, you copy? Well, look who finally decided to show up. Welcome back, Watertown. Any damage reports? Negative, no hull or superstructure damage, just heavy waves causing us to tilt. And no Gook vessels either. Jolly good, we're glad you're back then.
The group continued to sail through the fast-paced winds and high waves for another hour. At 9:52, the winds began to pick up near the front of the force.
Juno, Watertown, we have hard-hitting waves, perhaps 60 miles per hour, coming south-southwest, bearing 160 degrees. Over. Copy that. Right full rudder, southwest, bearing 200. We'll try to intercept this one at 30 knots. Roger that. Picking up speed southwest, bearing 200 degrees. Over. Copy that. 200. Turning right full rudder, waves nearly 6 feet high, going up onto our port side. Stay clear of port in case of rolling. Well, alright. Watertown, what's your status? You seem to be drifting farther on our radar. No damage so far to the hull. We are experiencing high waves, though. Steady as we can. We'll keep up with you. Alright. Radio in if you need assistance.
About 20 minutes after that call between the three, Juno checked their radar to see that there was no sign of the Watertown.
Belfast, this is Juno. Watertown has disappeared again. Watertown, this is Juno. Do you copy? What are your coordinates? Watertown, again, this is Juno. Do you have your bearings? Over.
After 10 minutes of waiting, at 10:22 p.m., the USS Watertown was officially declared missing. The Juno suspected that at first the Watertown had somehow lost power, and told her crew and the Belfast to look for her silhouette.
I'm very concerned about the welfare of Watertown. They're right behind us, experiencing some difficulty. No lights or radar is noticed from her direction at the moment. I sure hope he didn't take a nosedive.
At this time, the U.S. Coast Guard was not able to do any searches. The only nearest ships were weather ships in the North Pacific, but none of them were actually around the time of July 29th to help. Juno stated that they wanted to turn around and look for the Watertown, but they had to stay on course and meet up with the 7th Fleet, ultimately leaving the Watertown alone in the dark. On August 2nd, 1950, the Juno and Belfast made it through the Formosa Straits and met up with the 7th Fleet at Bunker Bay, Okinawa. The USS Juno continued on her duties, becoming the flagship for the Formosa Patrol Force, and later joined the Fast Carrier Task Force operating off the east coast of Korea. As for the Watertown, she still remains somewhere out there in the waters between Japan and Taiwan, with all 742 aboard missing. Public tension about the disappearance hit the States on August 1st, 1950. Multiple family members of the ones aboard the Watertown pressured the government to open up an investigation about the night of the 29th. And after 4 years of pressure and letters piling up, the US government authorized for the Coast Guard and Naval Board of Inquiry to issue an investigation on the disappearance on November 27, 1954. After months of conducting interviews and piling up information, a file was created with every name of the sailor from the Watertown, eyewitness accounts from Belfast and Juno, inspections at Sasebo Harbor, weather reports, and theories from civilians and experts, all culminated to what is known as the Watertown Files. On the last few pages of the Watertown Files was their final report. This report contains the US Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation and US Naval Board of Inquiry report to determine the probable cause of the casualty and recommendations to prevent reoccurrence. In the late evening of 29 July 1950, the USS Watertown, while in severe storm with a full crew of 742 persons, was reported missing. Watertown had left Sasebo Harbor in Nagasaki, Japan on the night of 28 July en route to Taiwan Strait, and was in communication with other vessels periodically throughout the voyage. At approximately 20:30, 29 July, Watertown reported waves crashing onto the starboard side and needed to slow but stay steady. Watertown did appear back in the group at 20:50, calling back to the USS Juno and HMS Belfast, reporting no damage but tilting. At 22:12, Watertown disappeared off Juno's radar screen. No distress messages or flares were received from the Watertown, and Juno and Belfast had to keep on going, leaving the Watertown behind. And while continuing the mission, no debris, bodies, and other flotsam was found. The report then goes on to relay vessel data, showing all recent fittings the Watertown went through before departing Sasebo Harbor, leaving the names of all missing 742 crewmen. And then the report moved on to the weather. A storm, which was described by a National Weather Service forecaster as a tropical storm and labeled as Helena, was generated east of Taiwan at 24 July, moving directly west. It made its way up nearing Asumi at 0710 on 28 July. The storm center progressed northwest of Nagasaki at 1840 on 29 July. The storm center continued to circle around off the coast of Nagasaki. By 0922 on the 30 July, the storm center had made a full circle, and then continued on 31 July at 11:57, heading directly west. At 21:52, 29 July, Belfast reported winds from 160 degrees south-southeast at 52 knots, temperature 37 degrees Fahrenheit, waves roughly 26 feet. Finally, after all this led-up information, the document finally reports on the conclusion. There were no survivors and no witnesses to the casualty. Information available to the Coast Guard and Naval Board of Inquiry consists of testimony of people who were aboard the other vessels in the area at the time Watertown was lost. A. Position. The only information available on the position and track line of Watertown is the weather reports by the National Weather Service and in testimony of captains and watch officers from Juno and Belfast, which stayed in front of Watertown. The position of Watertown to the nearest ship Juno cannot be reconstructed, as the positions by Juno and Belfast were noted by radar and not written nor recorded. B. Difficulties reported by Watertown. Watertown reported high waves crashing onto her port side and port side deck, causing her to tilt and develop a list. The result of the list, thought of by Captain McCoy of Watertown, was to be flooding in the cargo holds, until she returned to the forest at 2050. C. Causing. The most probable cause of the disappearance was that the ship was caught in the waves that Belfast noted were coming near the force at 21:52. The Watertown was eventually pushed off course due to the waves and possibly even damaged her radar system. Due to being stranded and lost sight of nearby ships, she probably attempted to return back to the group bearing 40 degrees. But the ship got caught up with so much waves, tilting the ship and waves crashing onto her port or starboard increased in volume, the vessel must have lost effective freeboard, finally resulting in such a loss of buoyancy and stability that the vessel plunged into the heavy seas. Because there were neither witnesses nor survivors, the actual final sequence of events culminating into the sinking of Watertown cannot be determined. Whatever the sequence, however, it is evident that the end had to be so rapid and catastrophic that there was no time to attempt to launch lifeboats or life rafts to don life jackets or even a distress call. The report ends with this before going on into recommendations. This tragic incident points out the need for all persons and sailors involved in actions taken in the seas to foster increased awareness of hazards which exist. There is no evidence of actionable misconduct, inattention to duty, negligence, or willful violation of law or regulation on the part of licensed or certified persons, nor evidence that failure of inspected material of equipment, nor evidence that personnel of the Coast Guard or any other government agency or any other person contributed to the cause of this tragedy. But contrary to what the Coast Guard and Naval Board of Inquiry found, many still remain unsatisfied and split about what happened, and even to this day, theories pop up. After telling a couple people I knew about the story, I asked them what they thought of it. and many of them attempted to come to their own conclusion with their own theories. These are their theories. When the Watertown was going up, I think she got swept up by the storm. I think the storm and boat arrived at that area at the same time, essentially sinking it. I think the boat was sunk in the storm or lost its way and ended up somewhere else. I'm sure a common theory is that the storm sank the ship, but in that case they probably would need to send up a flare or radio for help. But noting that the Juno or Belfast didn't document that suggests otherwise. If you look on the storm tracking map in the estimated area of disappearance, the storm was stalling around that area. It really depends then on how intense the storm was in that area to know what happened to her. I'm thinking that it probably got flooded and sank, tipped, etc. My initial impression of this story and theory of the USS Watertown's disappearance is the soon-to-be storm Helena throwing off its course. The ship tries to get back on the course but capsizes and sinks. The reason I assume for why there was no distress signals or flares is due to the storm probably damaging its communications. The ship was headed from Nagasaki to the Taiwan Strait, a path that in the end did show the most deadly. Hundreds of tons of steel lost without a trace of life. No wreckage, no cries for help. This report dated in 1950 marks it up to some accident, but there is no chance in reality that this was an accident. I believe something obviously happened. What we should acknowledge is that every ocean has something beneath it. The Atlantic has tales of Atlantis and the Bermuda Triangle, but one thing is never paid attention to is the true horror of the Pacific Ocean. Years before the ship sank, one writer, H.P. Lovecraft, wrote a story of which it speaks of a place in the Pacific Ocean. It's an underground monument called Relaya, home to Cthulhu. The USS Watertown was a fine example of only the beginning of what's to come for our waters. They were caught in a monsoon of the Sea of Madness. They didn't call for help simply because they weren't coherent enough to. Minds were running with jaws agape. Those sailors saw the definition of horror. For when the sea finally decides to turn on dry land, we too will see what those sailors saw. Well, the estimated area of the Watertown's disappearance is within the East China Sea, an area that is shallow compared to the rest of the Pacific. So if it had sunk, a shipwreck would have likely been discovered. This leads me to believe that the ship likely remained afloat and may have been hijacked. During the Korean War, Communist China was actively fighting against the US Allied forces in North Korea. The area of the disappearance and path of the storm leads directly to Shanghai. I believe the Chinese used the cover of the storm to hijack the Watertown, turn off its navigation, and use it to study American naval weaponry. In recent years, China is famous for stealing American weapon blueprints and using them to create Chinese knockoffs. So basically, I think the Chinese hacked the ship. Now personally, I have my theories, but that's for another day. Before I leave on to the next chapter and you come up with your own theories, I want to inform you all about Captain Theodore McCoy of Watertown. The following information makes it understandable on why he would constantly do inspection checks on the USS Watertown, as stated before. In 1943, McCoy's first ship of command was the Gearing-class destroyer USS Patzner, DD-891. He operated her in the Atlantic to protect convoys. Patzner also served in these convoys along with the Canadian Flower-class corvette HMCS Dodge, K-202. On one of these convoy missions on December 3, 1943, Captain McCoy was circling around the Victory ship SS Gillette Victory to depth charge a German U-boat. Unfortunately, McCoy, who had the con or control/console of the bridge, made his bearings incorrect and he slammed the bow of the Patzner into the port side bow of the SS Gillette Victory. His mistake didn't sink the Gillette Victory, just made a huge dent in the vessel. But unfortunately, that didn't stop a German sub from later torpedoing the SS Gillette Victory anyway. There was also another instance on this voyage where he rammed a U-boat trying to save the troopship HMT Brunzia. McCoy continued to serve with the USS Patzner until she was decommissioned in 1947. In 1949, he would then be tasked with commanding the new USS Fairbanks CA-142, a Des Moines-class cruiser. Although this would be short-lived, as in August of the same year he took command, he once again had the con and ran her aground off the coast of Maine. It was only his second voyage with her.
I only mention McCoy's past mishaps to conclude that that's probably why he was so cautious with the Watertown. He probably wanted the saying "third time's a charm" be real for him. But in the end, those are just theories. Maritime theories.
There are only 3 stories that claim to have seen the ghost of the Watertown. The first is from the crewmen aboard the USS Oklahoma City, SS-723. In 2005, during patrol in the Pacific Ocean, something was picked up on her radar heading straight for the ship's location. When they looked through the periscope, there was nothing to be seen for miles. When they looked back at the radar, the dot was gone. Some whack jobs believe that this is the Watertown, but I highly doubt it. The next takes place during a port visit to Busan, South Korea for the 50th anniversary of the Korean War. Sailors aboard the USS Patriot, MCM-7, spotted at night a shape in the distance off the harbor. The shape appeared to be noted as a late 40s, early 50s era ship. It just sailed along and eventually disappeared sailing into the distance. Thankfully, this event actually has physical documentation, where an unnamed US sailor took this photograph of the mystery ship's silhouette. This of course could be easily any other US or South Korean ship sailing in the distance, but we may never know as the original photographer of this image has never come forth. And the final theory I leave with you is the most mysterious and earliest known ghost story revolving around the Watertown. Operation Endsweep was a United States Navy and United States Marine Corps operation to neutralize American mines in North Vietnam's coastal and inland waterways after the Vietnam War's end. During this campaign, on March 10, 1973, crewmen from the minesweeper USS Enhance AM-437 spotted a shape drifting towards their craft. When the shape emerged more, it revealed to be a lifeboat. Upon closer inspection, the sailors of the Enhance were shocked to read the name on the side: USS Watertown, CL-122. The lifeboat was brought upon deck and was kept there for safekeeping. Later on the 17th, an engine room fire occurred on board the Enhance, where she was then towed to Subic Bay. Whatever happened to the Watertown lifeboat after that is unknown, gone like the original boat, without a trace. The question that arises to many when they hear this story is, how does a lifeboat from a ship that disappeared in 1950 suddenly reappear 23 years later? These 3 stories and many other instances of claiming to have seen the silhouette of the Watertown in the Pacific are all that's left of the Watertown. No underwater sonar detecting a wreck, no debris found washed ashore, nothing. Thus making the mystery of the Watertown still unknown to this day. Same with the likes of the Mary Celeste, Edmund Fitzgerald, USS Cyclops, SS Waratah, and many more. The USS Watertown remains as a vessel that we can only guess what happened to her based on speculation. Random mention, but in 1951, the United States Navy created a film about how to operate your vessel in fog. During the section about a ship that has lost power or damage, they used the Watertown as an example. It isn't mentioned, but the ship in question is very similar to Watertown.
Now let us see how these rules work in the case of a steam vessel underway on the high seas, which suddenly becomes disabled through some accident. During the moments that the vessel is coasting to a standstill, her proper signal will be the prolonged and too short blasts of a vessel not under command.
When doing background research for this video, I was led to a Reddit post posted on r/submechanophobia. The post states, "The wreck of the light cruiser USS Watertown lost in a storm in 1950 during the Korean War, found in the East China Sea." Below this is the following image. Now I believe this is completely faked. After reverse image searching and checking several news sites to determine whether the wreck was found, there's absolutely nothing. The post was made 2 years ago, and I even looked on the original poster's account, but there's really nothing. With so much uncertainty about this story, it's hard to comprehend what those 742 men went through that stormy night, seemingly gone in an instant. But all you can do is sit and wonder, recalling one part of theory remarked earlier. For when the sea finally decides to tread into dry land, we too will see what those sailors saw. You then think to yourself, why am I here? Why them? When will my time come? Then a shape forms in the fog. Questions race through your mind, and the ghosts become real.
Now, I hope you saw at the beginning this is a fictional story and all of it is a hoax, but it was still in good fun. And I'm sorry for anyone that did actually think that this was a real story throughout the whole thing. It's not. This channel is not meant for this type of stuff. My channel is not meant for fictitious stories, but rather true stories with real information. But be very aware, kids. If you live near a large body of water, and you hear on a quiet night whistle blasts coming from that large body of water, that might just be the Watertown sailors trying to find their way. But what do I know? I'm just a piece of toast on the internet.